The way drug approval works in the United States is that at a certain moment in time, a company might decide that they've done enough clinical studies to actually submit an application for marketing with the FDA. That's called a new drug application. At a certain moment, the FDA will have reviewed all of that information and will have to make a decision on whether or not to approve that product. If they choose to approve the product, then of course the letter goes out saying that. But if for whatever reason the FDA decides that the data are inadequate in some way, what they send to the company is called a complete response letter. And in that complete response letter, which is generally several pages long and has many different areas that it addresses, they will describe the various deficiencies that they encountered, which collectively have led to this decision not to approve the drug. That complete response letter is not made public by the FDA under our current regulations. Patients, doctors, other researchers may not have information. They may not be playing from a full deck. And if they're not playing from a full deck, then they can't make the scientifically best or clinically best decision for the patient. And so we wanted to find out to what degree the important scientific judgments that the FDA had reached were ultimately reaching researchers in particular. Because if a researcher doesn't know about other drugs that have run into trouble because of safety or effectiveness, they may go on to make the same mistakes themselves, unintentionally, of course. They may go on to keep researching a drug that really seems like it's never going to be fruitful. And in so doing, they might expose patients in trials to the dangers that had been detected by some other drug company already. But if we don't have all of that information, if everybody isn't sharing information in a full way, then we risk the chance of making those kinds of mistakes and really being inefficient in our efforts to develop new drugs. In the first part of the study, we looked at these letters called complete response letters, and we divided them up into their subject matter, whether or not they were about general topics, whether they were about effectiveness topics, whether they were about safety topics, labeling, manufacturing, etc. And we looked at the letters, divided them up into these components, and from that we were able to describe why it is that the FDA says that it has turned down a drug. The main thing that we learned from that analysis was that 87% of the 61 complete response letters that we studied have at least one mention of either safety or effectiveness, which are the main reasons one might be concerned. And so we learned from that that the FDA is not turning down drugs for trivial reasons, but rather for substantial ones. Sometimes the safety and effectiveness problems encountered are significant enough that the FDA will have asked the company to conduct an entirely new trial. And that's really a big deal if that's one of the findings, and that was frequently the case as well. So in the second part of the study, we tried to determine whether or not the information in these complete response letters was making its way into the public realm. And we looked in two places. In the main part of the study, we looked at press releases that the companies might choose to issue. And so we did an exhaustive search looking for press releases on the web. If we were unable to find a press release, then we contacted the company directly and asked them whether or not they had released one. Based on that, we learned that in about a fifth of these 61 complete response letters, there was no press release whatsoever. And in about an additional fifth, even if a press release was put out, it didn't contain much in the way of additional information. In fact, it had none of the specific pieces of information that were in FDA's complete response letter. So that left about 60% that had some degree of significant information that might be of use to a patient, to a researcher, to another drug company, for example, or to an investor. Overall, if you looked at the totality of all of the information that was in these 61 complete response letters, about 14% of it was making its way into the press releases. In general, what we found was that to the extent that the press releases were different than the complete response letters, it was not by subtle differences in the way things were described, but rather in the wholesale omission of important statements from the complete response letter. In this slide, you can see the 687 statements in the 61 complete response letters broken out by which of the 7 general areas the statements were in. You can see that safety and effectiveness statements are very common. And you can see that the matching rate for safety and effectiveness statements is only minimally higher than the overall matching rate, which was 14%. Among the statements that were sometimes not made public in press releases were 7 statements in different complete response letters that actually said that there was a higher mortality rate in the treated group compared to the placebo group. And of those 7 statements, only 1 of them actually made it to a press release. So we do think that the information is often not getting out there. It's true that the important information about whether or not a new clinical trial is necessary is more commonly conveyed in a press release than other kinds of statements. So overall, our matching rate was 14%. For statements about needing a new trial, the matching rate was 49%. But that still leaves half of even those very, very critical pieces of information that never made it into a press release. We understand that a press release is typically much shorter than a complete response letter. And indeed, our analysis of the length of these documents confirms that. So somebody might say, well, obviously the press release is shorter, therefore it will contain less information. Why are you surprised? I wouldn't say that we're surprised. We simply have documented the fact. The point is that the press release is not the right vehicle for conveying the kind of information that might be important to a patient, to a doctor, to an investor, to another researcher. It's just not the right vehicle for doing so. And that's what we're relying upon for the most part currently. What can be done about this problem? In our paper, we identify 3 basic ways forward. 1, the companies could put out more expansive press releases. Of course, so far they have not. A second option would be for the companies to release the complete response letters themselves. We didn't find such an example. And the third would be for FDA to revisit its regulations with respect to complete response letters and reconsider whether or not these documents ought to be made public.